Flight 907, a gleaming Boeing 777, carved a steady path through the pale blue sky, leaving a silver trail behind as it crossed the continental United States. Inside, the cabin hummed with the familiar rhythm of air travel, the muted chatter of passengers, the occasional clatter of cups and cutlery from the service carts, the soft whine of the ventilation system, and the faint, soothing hum of the engines. Outside, the sun glinted off the wing, painting streaks of gold across the polished aluminum. It was a picture-perfect morning at 35,000 feet. But amid the normalcy, a quiet tension seemed to settle in the air, almost imperceptible at first, like the static charge before a storm. Emily Carson, sitting in seat 14C, was blissfully unaware of what was about to unfold. She was an unassuming woman in her early 30s, with chestnut hair tied back in a loose ponytail and sharp hazel eyes that missed very little. A data analyst from Chicago, Emily had traveled frequently for work but always kept to herself, immersed in spreadsheets, emails, and a carefully curated playlist that drowned out the world. Today, she had been catching up on a report, headphones in, completely engrossed in the rhythm of her own thoughts. She watched the clouds slip beneath the aircraft like waves rolling across a silken sea. There was a serene beauty to it that always made her feel calm, even in the cramped confines of a commercial jet. She sipped from her coffee, taking a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the fleeting moment of peace. Across the aisle, a child pressed his tiny nose to the window, his eyes wide with wonder. His mother smiled, adjusting her scarf, oblivious to the world outside. Emily allowed herself a small smile as she watched them, briefly imagining a life she had yet to fully embrace. Maybe children, maybe family, maybe a quieter version of herself. But those thoughts vanished as quickly as they came, replaced by the familiar focus on work. Suddenly, the intercom crackled, the static cutting through the soft cabin noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was steady at first, the usual monotone reassurance passengers expected. Then there was a pause, too long, a silence that felt sharp and jarring, like a knife slicing through the hum of the engines. Emily's fingers froze on the keyboard. "Both pilots are," the voice faltered, a stutter that sent a ripple of unease through the cabin. The announcement cut off abruptly. Silence. A strange, heavy silence. A collective pause that made even the chattering passengers fall quiet. Then came a sudden, terrifying realization. The captain's voice had gone completely silent, and through the thin cockpit door nothing moved. The hum of the autopilot was there, yes, but there was no reassurance, no presence, only the faint, mechanical whir of the aircraft. Emily's heart skipped a beat. Her coffee trembled in her hand. She looked around, but the world seemed frozen. Flight attendants, usually confident and composed, were exchanging panicked glances. A mother's hand clutched her child tightly. A businessman pressed his forehead to his phone, murmuring incomprehensible numbers as if negotiating with fate itself. The elderly man a few rows back was gripping the armrests, eyes wide, lips white, muttering prayers under his breath. Emily realized with a jolt that she couldn't feel the pilot's presence at all. She wasn't trained to notice subtle signs, but instinct screamed that something was very wrong. Both pilots, the people in control of this enormous metal bird, the ones whose lives and expertise she had trusted, were gone, incapacitated in some way. The cockpit door remained ominously closed, a barrier between the helpless passengers and the critical controls beyond. Panic began to ripple outward, infecting the cabin. A man in business attire shouted, "What's happening?" Another passenger shrieked as the plane tilted slightly with a minor turbulence that suddenly seemed monumental. Flight attendants rushed to calm passengers, but their own fear was unmistakable. The air inside the cabin felt thicker now, charged with fear, anxiety, and confusion. People were gripping seats, clinging to each other, murmuring frantic prayers. Every second felt stretched beyond reality, time itself seeming to slow as dread pooled like water at the bottom of Emily's stomach. Emily's eyes flicked to the cockpit door again. Through the small window she could just make out the two pilots slumped forward, unmoving, The thought that crossed her mind made her chest tighten. What if they weren't coming back? What if no one on this plane could take control? She pressed her palms to her knees, trying to steady herself, trying to think rationally. The autopilot was still engaged, but for how long? And if it failed, what then? The intercom remained dead. No captain, no instructions. Just the low, constant hum of the engines and the soft, eerie whine of warning lights flashing in the cockpit, visible through the small window. Emily felt a cold, creeping terror brush against her spine. She wasn't a pilot. She didn't know the first thing about flying a commercial airliner. But staring at that door, at those unmoving figures, she realized something terrifying. She might have to do something. A sudden jolt shook the plane, minor turbulence. Nothing unusual under normal circumstances. But in the current context, it felt like the first real tremor of impending disaster. Screams erupted spontaneously from the rear, mingling with cries of confusion and disbelief. Flight attendants were moving frantically, trying to administer oxygen masks and calm terrified passengers, but chaos had already taken root. Emily's mind raced. She ran through a mental checklist, desperate for any sliver of hope. Emergency procedures. She had memorized a few for travel safety courses years ago, but those were theoretical, nothing that would prepare her for this scale of crisis. She glanced around, noting small details. The illuminated signs for life vests, the first aid kits, the escape paths, all trivial compared to what she might be forced to do. Then she noticed it. The autopilot panel blinking red through the cockpit window. Tiny, precise lights, almost insignificant to anyone else, but for Emily it represented a lifeline. If she could reach it, maybe she could prevent the worst. Maybe, just maybe, she could buy enough time for someone, anyone, to help. The seatbelt sign pinged on and off, almost mocking her with its normalcy. Panic was growing into a tangible entity, wrapping itself around every passenger and flight attendant. Emily's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst. Her laptop, forgotten now, sat on her tray table as if waiting to remind her of a safer, simpler world. But that world had vanished. A mother screamed for her child again, her voice high and raw, piercing through the cabin. An elderly man collapsed into his seat, trembling. Emily clenched her fists, trying to anchor herself to reality. And then it came, the sound that would forever haunt her. A faint metallic clank from the cockpit, a shift in weight, a movement she could not identify. Her pulse surged. Both pilots remained slumped, but something was happening beyond the door. Emily realized in that instant that nothing, no training, no experience, no hope of rescue, could absolve her from the stark truth. Someone would have to act. And if she didn't, 524 lives would hang in the balance. Her mind flashed to her own family, her own life. She was a quiet, ordinary woman in 14C. Nobody would expect her to do anything extraordinary. But she was all that stood between survival and catastrophe. She took a deep breath, palms sweating, legs shaking, and stood. The eyes of hundreds of strangers seemed to fall on her, whether she noticed or not. Flight attendants tried to intervene, voices trembling. "You can't," one said, but Emily moved forward, propelled by a force beyond reason. The autopilot panel glowed, a tiny beacon of hope, and Emily reached toward it, fingers hovering above buttons she barely understood. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. The engines hummed. The lights flickered ominously. And outside, the endless sky continued, indifferent to the terror inside. In that moment, as the first real thread of action coiled around her, Emily Carson became the most crucial presence on the entire plane. One wrong move, and all 524 lives aboard Flight 907 could be lost in an instant. One correct move, and she might just guide them through the unimaginable. She pressed a trembling hand against the panel, heart hammering, and whispered to herself, "I have to do this. I have no choice." And then the cockpit door shuddered, as if responding to her determination, a tiny crack of light hinting at the chaos that awaited beyond. Emily's fingers hovered over the autopilot panel, trembling as if they had a life of their own. Every instinct screamed that this was impossible. She wasn't a pilot, hadn't spent hours in flight school, had never even touched a real yoke beyond a simulator app she'd used years ago. And yet, staring at the flashing red lights, the dormant autopilot, and the slumped figures of the pilots, she realized she had no other choice. The cabin around her had descended into organized chaos, or perhaps the opposite. Panic had a life of its own, spreading faster than fire. Passengers shouted at flight attendants, pointing fingers, demanding answers, or simply screaming into the void. Children wailed in terror, their parents trying desperately to soothe them with trembling hands and fractured voices. A man in a suit was packing the aisle, muttering numbers and coordinates, as though repetition could conjure a miracle. The seatbelt sign flashed on and off, a cruel reminder that the normal rules of flight still existed, even as the pilots lay incapacitated. Emily's attention snapped back to the cockpit door. Through the small window, she could see the two pilots slumped forward. One had an arm draped across the console, head tilted unnaturally. The other's hands twitched slightly as if fighting against some invisible force. A warning light blinked relentlessly. A soft, ominous hum of engines filled the background like a low drumbeat, growing louder in her ears. She realized that if the autopilot failed, the plane could pitch, roll, or dive with catastrophic speed. Time was not on their side. "Miss, you can't do that," one of the flight attendants shouted, finally stepping in front of her. Her voice trembled, a mix of fear and disbelief. "You don't know what you're doing." I have to try," Emily replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Her hazel eyes locked on the blinking console. "There's no one else. If we wait, everyone dies." The flight attendant hesitated, searching Emily's face, then stepped aside with a trembling nod. Other passengers noticed her movement toward the cockpit. Some laughed nervously, uncertain if this was a performance or a tragedy in progress. Others whispered prayers or gasped in silent awe. A tension like static electricity charged the cabin. Every eye in Emily's direction seemed to ask the same unspoken question: can she actually do it? Emily took a tentative step forward, navigating through the sea of panicked bodies. A sudden jolt rocked the plane, throwing her against the armrest. She gasped, gripping the seat for support, and saw the effect of the turbulence ripple through the cabin. Luggage shifted, a drink spilled, a man's briefcase slid across the floor. Screams erupted, merging into one overwhelming cacophony of fear. She reached the cockpit window. The blinking autopilot panel was tantalizingly close, almost within reach. But the cabin was a gauntlet, passengers clinging to seats, flight attendants shouting, a child's scream piercing the noise. She crouched slightly, weaving her way between rows of panicked travelers. Each movement felt monumental, as if the floor itself was tilting beneath her. Emily finally arrived at the panel. Her fingers trembled above the buttons. Instructions she had memorized from a flight safety tutorial flickered through her mind. Autopilot override, locate primary yoke, stabilize altitude, communicate with ATC. The words felt abstract, meaningless. She didn't know which button was primary, which switch critical, which lever could mean survival or doom. And yet she couldn't hesitate. A sudden panicked voice yelled, "Stop! You'll make it worse." Emily flinched, turning to see a young man lunging toward her. His eyes were wide, wild, filled with the raw energy of fear. Without thinking, she shoved him back gently but firmly, muttering, "I have to try." His hands gripped the seat as though the chair itself could hold him in place. He muttered something incoherent, then sank back, trembling, staring at her as if she were both savior and harbinger. Emily's heart raced. She reached for the autopilot controls, fumbling with the buttons, searching for the one that would give her control. A sudden alarm blared, a shrill, terrifying sound that made everyone in the cabin flinch. The autopilot had triggered a secondary alert. Panic surged again. A woman screamed, holding her face in her hands. The plane jolted slightly, as if reminding them all of the stakes. Emily's hands shook violently. She took a deep breath, forcing her mind to focus. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her, the weight of hundreds of lives pressing down, almost tangible. Every instinct told her to run, to sit down, to hide. But something deeper, a primal surge of responsibility, held her in place. She pressed the first button. Nothing. She toggled the second switch. The warning beep stopped briefly, replaced by a quieter, steady tone. Emily's stomach lurched with a flicker of hope, The autopilot had responded. She had made contact, but relief was short-lived. The plane shuddered violently again. A low rumble echoed through the cabin, different from turbulence. Something was wrong with one of the engines. The sound was subtle but menacing, like a predator stalking from the shadows. Passengers screamed again. Flight attendants shouted over the noise, instructing people to stay calm, to fasten seatbelts, to breathe. But calm had left the building, replaced by a visceral, raw fear that twisted in the stomach like a knife. Emily gritted her teeth, forcing her panic down, channeling it into focus. She had to stabilize the plane, had to prevent catastrophe. Suddenly, a man in the rear of the cabin shouted, "We're going down!" The words sent a ripple of terror through the plane, passengers clutching seats and each other, their faces pale, mouths open in silent screams. Emily's chest tightened. She couldn't let them lose hope, not yet. Not until she knew what she could do. The autopilot panel flickered again. She toggled another switch. Slowly, the beeping stabilized, replaced by the low hum of a controlled system. The plane leveled slightly. A collective gasp of relief rippled through the cabin. Emily dared a glance around. Some passengers were staring at her, wide-eyed, disbelief and hope mingled in equal measure. Others had tears streaming down their faces, gripping loved ones. One elderly man whispered almost inaudibly, "God bless her." But the brief reprieve was shattered by another jolt. The plane lurched violently, throwing passengers into the overhead bins and seats. Screams erupted again, louder, more desperate. Emily gritted her teeth, adjusting her grip on the controls. She didn't fully understand the autopilot, didn't know what each lever did, but instinct and a flicker of memory guided her fingers. Then she noticed something she hadn't before, a faint, pulsing red light on the warning panel she hadn't touched. It was the secondary engine alert, subtle but unmistakable. One engine was failing. Her stomach dropped. The plane could still fly on one engine, but only if she acted decisively. Hesitation could mean disaster. A child screamed in terror beside her, and a mother hugged her tightly, sobbing. Emily swallowed hard, ignoring the chaos, and reached for the throttle. She had watched videos of emergency procedures, read articles about engine failures, memorized the basics. Now it was all she had. She pulled the throttle gently, adjusting power distribution as best as she could. The plane shuddered, threatening to tilt sideways, but it held. Somewhere in the cabin, a flight attendant whispered almost to herself, "I can't believe she's doing this." Emily didn't look up. She had no time. Every nerve, every thought, every ounce of focus was on keeping Flight 907 airborne. She could feel the eyes of 524 passengers on her, a weight beyond comprehension. Then through the hum of engines and panicked murmurs, she heard a faint, static voice over the intercom. It was weak, distorted, but unmistakable. "Flight 907, do you read?" Emily froze, heart hammering. Could it be air traffic control? The sound gave her hope, but also a chilling awareness. This was not over, not by a long shot. She swallowed, fingers trembling, and whispered to herself, "I have to answer. I have to do this." Outside the plane, the horizon was beginning to darken. Clouds had thickened, faint streaks of lightning illuminating their jagged edges. The calm morning had vanished, replaced by the ominous roar of a brewing storm. Inside, Flight 907 teetered on the edge of disaster. Emily Carson, quiet woman in 14C, realized that the moment of truth had arrived. She was no longer a passenger. She was the line between life and death, and one misstep could end everything. With her hands on the controls, she made a decision that would define not just this flight, but her life, whether she would rise to the occasion or be crushed by the impossible task before her. And as the storm clouds loomed closer, the engines groaned again, more insistently this time. The autopilot flickered. The plane tilted slightly, enough to send a shiver of fear through the cabin. Emily took a deep, steadying breath. She was about to become the most important person in the sky. Emily Carson's palms were slick with sweat as she stared at the blinking autopilot panel. Every instinct screamed at her to step back, to sit down, to let someone else take over. But there was no one else. Both pilots were slumped and unresponsive, their lives hanging by a fragile thread. And now, with a storm building on the horizon, Emily understood with absolute clarity. If she didn't act, 524 lives were at risk. She swallowed, forcing a deep, steadying breath. The plane trembled slightly under a subtle turbulence, but to Emily it felt like a warning, a whisper from fate itself. She scanned the cockpit panel, her eyes darting from switch to switch, button to button, desperate for some recognizable pattern. She had no real training. None. Only a flight simulator app she had used years ago, obscure YouTube tutorials, and her stubborn will to survive. But instinct, sharpened by fear, was guiding her hands. Around her, the cabin teetered on the edge of collapse. The collective panic of hundreds of passengers pressed against her like a tangible weight. Mothers held children close, whispering reassurances they didn't believe. A man with trembling hands clutched a briefcase, muttering numbers as if incantations could stave off catastrophe. The hum of the engines was now joined by the occasional, ominous creak of stressed metal. Emily's stomach churned with nausea and adrenaline. A flight attendant, face pale and trembling, stepped up beside her. "You can't possibly," she began, but Emily shook her head. "I don't have a choice," Emily said firmly, voice trembling but resolute. "If I don't do this, everyone dies." The flight attendant hesitated, eyes wide, then slowly stepped back, giving Emily room to reach the critical panel. Emily pressed a trembling finger against the first button, unsure if she was activating something essential or triggering disaster. The panel beeped. A faint green light replaced one of the red alerts. A surge of hope flickered, quickly drowned by a new warning. The right engine was failing. Emily's heart pounded. She had watched videos of emergency landings, memorized the steps in her head like a sacred chant. Now it was time to act. Hands shaking, she located the throttle levers and adjusted them slightly, following a vague memory of a simulator scenario. The engines responded, the shuddering lessening for a brief, precious moment. Behind her, chaos continued to unfold. A child cried, his tiny fists gripping his mother's sleeves. A businessman muttered frantic calculations, lips moving silently. Flight attendants attempted to calm passengers, but their own fear was unmistakable. Emily forced herself to ignore it all. Focus. One step at a time. A sudden turbulence jolt threw a magazine from a nearby seat, sliding past her feet. Emily swore under her breath, gripping the throttle tighter. She could feel the plane responding, subtly, minutely, but enough to suggest that her actions mattered. Her breath caught when she saw the autopilot screen stabilize slightly. The blinking red warning faded for a heartbeat. Then came a new sound, a low rumble beneath the wings. The failing engine groaned, a subtle but terrifying note of impending disaster. Emily's stomach dropped. She had to compensate manually, but the instructions she remembered from videos and tutorials were vague at best. The plane shuddered again, violently this time, and the cabin erupted into panic screams. A passenger grabbed her arm. "You don't know what you're doing," he yelled, eyes wide with raw terror. Emily wrenched free, voice firm. "I have to, please step back." The man froze, then reluctantly moved aside. Emily's mind raced. She couldn't just adjust the throttle, she had to stabilize the plane's attitude. The yoke was within reach. She gripped it, hands shaking violently, and gently nudged the nose up. Instruments flickered as the plane responded. It was a small adjustment, but it was enough to prevent an immediate tilt. Relief surged briefly, but Emily didn't allow herself to relax. The intercom crackled, a faint voice breaking through the static. "Flight 907, this is Denver approach. Do you copy?" Emily's head snapped up. Her fingers hovered over the yoke, heart hammering. Could it be ATC? Could someone actually hear her? She swallowed hard, gripping the controls with renewed determination. Yes, this is Flight 907, she stammered, voice barely audible over the engine roar. "Copy, Flight 907. We've received your emergency signal. Can you confirm crew status?" the voice responded. Emily's stomach sank. Crew status. The two pilots are down. Both pilots incapacitated. I am alone in control, she admitted, voice shaking but firm. She could hear the intake of air on the other side. The controller paused. Understood. Maintain altitude. We will guide you. Do you have control of the yoke? Emily nodded, though they couldn't see her. I think so. Good, follow our instructions. We'll get you down safely. The words should have been comforting, but Emily felt a new wave of fear wash over her. Guidance or not, the plane was still heavily compromised. The failing engine groaned again, louder this time. The storm on the horizon had thickened, dark clouds stretching like an ominous ceiling. Lightning flickered intermittently, illuminating terrified faces and overhead bins rattling with turbulence. The sense of urgency was suffocating. Emily focused on the instruments in front of her. Altitude indicators, airspeed, and engine readings flashed. She moved the yoke gently, adjusting for balance. The plane shuddered slightly but steadied enough to suggest that her efforts were working. Sweat stung her eyes, hair plastered to her forehead. She could hear passengers whispering, some sobbing quietly, some murmuring prayers. All of them were aware, in some primal way, that their fate rested in the hands of a woman in 14C who had never flown a plane in real life. Suddenly the plane lurched again, violently, almost tipping toward the failing engine. Screams erupted. A mother held her child tighter, rocking back and forth. A businessman pressed his forehead to the window, muttering something incoherent. Emily gritted her teeth and pushed the yoke forward slightly, trying to compensate. The engines roared, the autopilot flickered, and the plane responded. For the first time, a fragile hope began to take root. But there was no time to celebrate. The storm was closer now, lightning flashing across jagged clouds. Rain pelted the fuselage in sheets. Emily could feel the vibration in the floor, the low hum of the engines, the slight tilt threatening to throw the plane off balance. Every second felt like an eternity. One misstep could mean disaster. She glanced at the autopilot panel again. The red alerts had returned. The failing engine threatened to shut down completely. She had a choice: rely on the autopilot for stability or take manual control and risk everything. Her heart pounded. Hands shaking, she reached for the yoke again. This was no longer theory. This was life or death. A flight attendant appeared beside her, eyes wide with fear and awe. You're actually doing it," she whispered. Emily didn't respond. She didn't have time. Her focus was absolute. Every nerve in her body screamed for calm, even as adrenaline surged. The intercom crackled again. Flight 907, adjust altitude by 500 feet and prepare for vector to the nearest runway. Emily swallowed. That meant landing soon. She had to stabilize the plane long enough to follow instructions. Her hands tightened around the yoke. The first movement was tentative, barely perceptible. The plane responded. She adjusted slightly, then more decisively. Instruments stabilized for a moment. The passengers' panic softened into tense quiet. Some were holding hands, some were gripping seat handles, all eyes on her, consciously or unconsciously. Emily realized the terrifying truth. She had crossed the point of no return. She wasn't a passenger anymore. She wasn't just a woman in 14C, she was the sole line of defense against catastrophe. Every decision, every movement, every choice mattered. And beyond the storm, beyond the failing engine, beyond the flashing warning lights, one final question loomed. Could she land the plane safely? Outside, the dark storm clouds stretched like a looming wall. Lightning crackled, illuminating the distant horizon in stark, jagged light. Emily's breath caught. She had taken control, stabilized the plane, and communicated with ATC. But the most dangerous part was yet to come, guiding 524 lives through chaos, storm, and human fear to the solid ground below. And in that moment, as Flight 907 trembled under the strain of failing systems and rising panic, Emily Carson made a silent vow. She would not let them die. Not if she had to command, reason, and act with every ounce of strength in her body. She pressed forward, her hands steadying on the yoke, eyes fixed on the instruments, heart hammering, mind sharpening, as the plane fought the storm and the failing engine for its life. The moment of truth was approaching, and there was no turning back. Emily Carson's pulse raced as she hovered by the cockpit door, fingers trembling over the small, flashing autopilot panel. She had never flown a plane before, not really, and yet here she was, the only person capable of preventing an unimaginable disaster. Both pilots were slumped, lifeless against the controls, their radios dead. Panic had already spread through the cabin, a living, breathing entity, suffocating, merciless. The intercom silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional low hum of the engines and the distant shouts of terrified passengers. She glanced at the two pilots again, her stomach twisting. One arm hung limply across the console, the other twitching slightly, almost as if the body itself were aware of the danger yet powerless to act. The autopilot lights flickered ominously, green, then red, then nothing, taunting her with their indecipherable language of life and death. A sick feeling rolled through Emily. If she didn't do something now, Flight 907 and every soul on board would be doomed. The cabin around her had erupted into chaos. Mothers clutched crying children, passengers screamed at one another, flight attendants rushed down the aisles trying to administer oxygen, calm passengers, and maintain some semblance of order. But it was hopeless. The air was thick with fear, and Emily could feel it pressing down on her, demanding that she retreat, that she surrender to the hopelessness of the moment. But she couldn't. She pressed a trembling hand against the metal frame of the cockpit door, trying to steady herself. She had always been quiet, unassuming, blending into the background of life. Now she realized that ordinary didn't matter. Ordinary wouldn't save anyone. Only action mattered. Taking a deep breath, she glanced around, noting every detail she might need. The emergency instructions in her mind from a safety video, the small lights on the autopilot panel, the subtle hum of the engines, the tilt of the plane as minor turbulence rippled through the cabin. She could do this. She had to. "I have," you said. Continue Part 4, 1200 words. ChatGPT said. Absolutely. Here's Part 4 fully expanded to 1,200 words, continuing the cinematic, suspenseful story of Emily taking control of Flight 907. Part 4, Contact Expanded. Emily's fingers hovered over the autopilot panel, the tiny lights blinking red and green like the pulse of a creature she could neither understand nor predict. She had memorized a few emergency procedures from videos and flight safety guides, but memorization was one thing, actual execution another entirely. The plane trembled slightly under minor turbulence, yet to Emily it felt like the first sinister pulse of the disaster threatening to overtake them. Around her, the cabin's chaos escalated. A mother sobbed into her child's hair. An elderly man pressed his face against the window, eyes wide with terror. A businessman muttered numbers rapidly, as if the sheer repetition could conjure salvation. Flight attendants dashed up and down the aisles, struggling to calm passengers, but their voices barely penetrated the thick, oppressive fear. It was as if time itself had slowed, stretching every second into a miniature eternity. Emily's gaze returned to the cockpit window. Both pilots remained slumped, inert, as the warning lights flickered relentlessly. One engine had already begun to sputter, a subtle but horrifying hum beneath the drone of the main engines. Her stomach lurched. The plane was alive but barely, teetering on the edge of a mechanical cliff. She could almost feel the weight of 524 lives pressing into her back, demanding that she act. I can do this," she muttered, more to convince herself than anyone else. But doubt clawed at her. She wasn't trained. She had never flown a plane beyond a simulator app she dabbled in years ago. And yet, instinct, the fierce, relentless instinct of survival and responsibility, was guiding her forward. She stepped closer, her hands reaching for the panel. A flight attendant appeared beside her, face pale, eyes wide. You can't," she stammered. Her hands shook. "You don't know what you're doing." Emily turned toward her, voice trembling but firm. "If I don't try, everyone dies. I have to do this." The flight attendant hesitated, fear etched in every line of her face, then slowly stepped back, realizing the truth. Emily was the only one who could act. The corridor felt impossibly long as Emily moved forward, weaving through terrified passengers and scattered service carts. Every footstep was deliberate, measured, as if one wrong move could send the plane into a nosedive. She reached the cockpit panel and pressed a button tentatively. The red alerts persisted, but one green light flickered faintly, a tiny beacon of hope. Encouraged, she toggled another switch. The alarm ceased momentarily, replaced by a quiet hum of the autopilot stabilizing, enough to keep Flight 907 from immediately tilting. Her stomach twisted. It was a fragile victory. A single misstep could undo it all. Suddenly, a man in the aisle lunged toward her. "You don't know what you're doing. Stop." His eyes were wide with raw terror, hands trembling. Emily's mind raced, heart pounding. "I have to try," she shouted, shoving him gently but firmly aside. The man froze, startled, then sank back against a seat, staring at her with a mixture of fear and awe. She gripped the yoke, hands slick with sweat. Her vision narrowed to the instrument panel and the flickering lights. She adjusted the throttle slightly, following a patchwork of memory from flight simulators and emergency videos. The engines responded, the shuddering easing briefly. Relief surged, but was short-lived. One engine was already compromised. The plane shuddered again. She could feel the vibration through her fingers, up through her arms, into her chest. Then came the intercom. A voice, faint and distorted, crackled through the cabin. "Flight 907, do you copy?" Emily's heart jumped. Her fingers froze on the yoke. Could it be ATC? Could someone actually hear her? She swallowed hard and responded, voice shaking. "Yes. Yes, this is Flight 907. Both pilots are incapacitated. I am in control." The controller's voice paused, measured, calm, authoritative. "Understood. We've received your emergency signal. Can you maintain control of the aircraft?" Emily nodded, though they couldn't see her. I think so." "Good, follow our instructions. We'll guide you to the nearest runway." Hope surged briefly, but the faint reassurance only highlighted the enormity of the task ahead. The failing engine groaned, a subtle but unmistakable warning. The approaching storm, previously a distant shadow, now dominated the horizon, dark, angry clouds streaked with jagged lightning. The plane was airborne chaos incarnate, trembling under Emily's hands, yet she was the only line between life and death. She glanced back at the cabin. Passengers were frozen, watching her in stunned silence. Some whispered prayers, others held each other tight, staring at the floor as though that could anchor them. Emily realized that at that moment, every life on the plane depended entirely on her ability to make decisions she didn't fully understand, guided only by instinct, observation, and raw courage. Adjusting the yoke slightly, she nudged the nose of the plane upward, countering the minor turbulence threatening to tilt the aircraft. The instruments flickered but held steady. She took a deep breath, focusing on the sensation of control beneath her fingertips. Her heart hammered, but she forced herself to think clearly, step by step. First, stabilize. Then, communicate. Then, survive. The cabin trembled again, a violent shudder that sent a cup sliding off a nearby tray. A mother screamed as her child clutched her arms, rocking back and forth. The sound was deafening, a visceral reminder of the stakes. Emily's hands shook, but she held firm. She had to. She would not falter now. The intercom crackled again. "Flight 907, adjust altitude to maintain stability. Prepare for vectoring to the nearest runway." Emily swallowed. This was it, the first real instruction from ATC. The storm loomed ahead, the failing engine groaned with renewed insistence, and the autopilot, though momentarily compliant, remained unpredictable. One wrong move, and Flight 907 could spiral into disaster. She adjusted the throttle, then the yoke, nudging the plane into the requested altitude. The hum of the engines responded obediently, though the right engine still sputtered ominously. She could feel the weight of every life aboard pressing on her, a force she had never experienced before. And yet, amid the chaos, she found a strange clarity. Action was all that mattered now. Suddenly, lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the terrified faces of passengers and the shaking cabin in stark, white brilliance. Emily swallowed, gripping the yoke tighter. The storm was no longer a distant threat. It was upon them. Rain began to batter the fuselage, each droplet a reminder of the urgency. The plane pitched slightly, then leveled as Emily's trembling fingers guided it through the turbulence. She realized the cockpit was no longer just a place of control, it was a battlefield. She was the commander, the guardian, the single human standing between 524 lives and oblivion. Her eyes flicked between instruments, the autopilot lights, and the horizon visible through the cockpit window. Each second was a delicate dance, every movement potentially catastrophic. Emily's chest ached, her mind exhausted from adrenaline and fear. She had already stabilized the plane enough to follow ATC instructions, but she knew this was only the beginning. The storm, the failing engine, and the enormous responsibility of guiding hundreds of lives toward safety had only just begun. A child whimpered behind her, and Emily felt a surge of determination. She could not fail. She would not fail. Every instinct, every ounce of courage, every fragment of knowledge she possessed would be devoted to keeping Flight 907 in the air. And as she pressed her palms against the controls, preparing to follow the vector to the nearest runway, Emily realized with chilling clarity, the plane's survival, and the survival of everyone aboard, depended entirely on her next moves. Outside, the storm clouds thickened. Lightning split the sky. The wind howled like a living thing. Inside, Flight 907 teetered on the knife's edge of disaster. Emily Carson, the quiet woman in 14C, was about to take control of a plane in crisis. One wrong decision could doom them all, but one right decision could save them. And in that suspended moment between fear and action, Emily gritted her teeth, tightened her grip, and whispered to herself, "I can do this, I have to." This completes Part 4 at 1,200 words, showing Emily's first real interaction with ATC, stabilizing the plane, managing panicked passengers, and facing the approaching storm. The suspense and tension are high, with the failing engine and chaos setting up Part 5. I can continue with Part 5, where Emily begins the first maneuvers to actively stabilize and control the plane while the storm intensifies. Do you want me to continue with Part 5 next? You said. Continue Part 5, 1,200 words. ChatGPT said. Absolutely. Here's Part 5 fully expanded to 1,200 words, continuing the cinematic, high-stakes story of Emily and Flight 907. Part 5, First Maneuvers expanded. The storm outside had thickened into a roiling wall of dark clouds, jagged with occasional forks of lightning that illuminated the panicked faces of passengers through the cabin windows. Rain pelted the fuselage like a relentless drumbeat, the wind shrieking around the plane. The hum of the engines had become a strained, groaning roar, punctuated by the sputtering of the right engine that had been giving Emily her first real test of control. Each vibration, each subtle pitch of the plane, seemed amplified, and she could feel the tension in the aircraft's frame like the heartbeat of a living creature on the edge of collapse. Emily gripped the yoke with both hands, knuckles white. She could hear the panicked whispers and gasps from the cabin behind her, the children crying, mothers clutching them tightly, flight attendants issuing instructions that barely pierced the thick veil of fear. Every sound was magnified, every movement felt like an earthquake. She had stabilized the plane enough to respond to ATC instructions, but that was only the beginning. The next step would determine whether Flight 907 remained airborne or spiraled into disaster. Flight 907 adjust altitude to 32,000 feet and reduce airspeed by 15 knots. Storm is intensifying. Vectoring to nearest safe runway is in progress. Do you copy? The voice over the intercom was calm but urgent. Emily nodded to herself, though they could not see her. Copy, adjusting now, she replied, voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. The first maneuver required finesse. She gently pulled back on the yoke, easing the nose of the plane upward while subtly adjusting the throttle. The right engine sputtered, threatening to falter entirely, and the plane lurched. Her heart leaped into her throat, adrenaline spiking. Sweat ran down her temple and pooled at the nape of her neck. She had no choice but to trust the instruments, the tiny lights that blinked like stars in a chaotic constellation, guiding her hands with abstract certainty. A violent jolt rocked the plane. Passengers screamed, a symphony of terror. A tray table collapsed, sending cups of coffee skidding across the floor. Emily's stomach twisted. She pressed harder on the yoke, nudging the aircraft into alignment. The plane groaned in protest but slowly stabilized. Relief was fleeting. The storm was unyielding, and the failing engine continued its ominous sputtering. Behind her, the cabin's panic seemed to crescendo. A flight attendant clutched the edge of a seat, voice breaking as she whispered, She's actually doing it." Emily did not have the luxury of looking back. Every second counted, every adjustment critical. She focused entirely on the instruments, the autopilot panel, and the subtle feedback from the plane's controls. The intercom crackled again. Flight 907, maintain current heading. Reduce descent rate to 500 feet per minute. We're guiding you to an emergency approach. Do you have control of the yoke? Emily swallowed hard, eyes flicking between the instruments and the turbulent horizon. I have control," she replied, voice firm. It was the first moment she truly felt the weight of responsibility. She was no longer a passenger. She was the only person standing between Flight 907 and catastrophe. The next maneuver was critical, a controlled bank to align with the emergency vector provided by ATC. Emily hesitated for only a fraction of a second, then pushed the yoke to the right. The plane leaned, a slow, controlled tilt. The passengers were jostled, some crying out in alarm, but the aircraft remained steady. She could feel the strain on the engines as they compensated for the maneuver, the right engine sputtering under the added load. Lightning illuminated the cockpit, briefly revealing the two incapacitated pilots slumped forward. Emily's stomach clenched at the sight. The knowledge that she was the only one who could prevent disaster pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. She pressed forward, hands steadying the yoke, focusing entirely on the instruments and the faint instructions from ATC. "Adjust throttle to compensate for engine failure," the controller instructed. Emily's mind raced. She moved the left throttle slightly forward, nudging the plane into balance while keeping the nose steady. The autopilot seemed to respond, flickering with tentative compliance. Another violent jolt rocked the aircraft. The plane shuddered as if testing her resolve, and Emily gritted her teeth, pressing her body into the yoke, muscles taut with tension. A woman screamed behind her, clutching her child, but Emily could not falter. One wrong move now would end everything. She adjusted the yoke, nudging the plane into a smoother bank, then carefully leveled it. The instruments indicated minimal deviation. She exhaled slowly, but the relief was only momentary. The storm outside continued to rage, the failing engine groaning ominously. Emily realized the next step was the most dangerous. She had to maintain altitude while reducing speed and preparing for an approach. One miscalculation, one hesitation, could send the plane into a rapid descent. She adjusted the throttles carefully, monitoring the engine's responses. The left engine roared under the extra load while the right sputtered, threatening to die. Every micro-adjustment mattered, every movement deliberate. The cabin had fallen into a tense silence, punctuated only by the hum of engines and the occasional cry or gasp. Passengers were aware, at some instinctive level, that something extraordinary was unfolding. Emily could feel their eyes on her, could sense their fear and hope intertwining. It was terrifying and oddly grounding. She had never been so acutely aware of her responsibility. Lightning forked across the sky again, momentarily blinding her through the cockpit window. Rain lashed against the fuselage, battering the aircraft with unrelenting intensity. The plane shuddered violently, threatening to tilt. Emily adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and whispered to herself, "Steady, steady." Another jolt, another scream. The autopilot flickered, almost as if it too were struggling against the chaos. Emily pressed her hands firmly against the controls, forcing the plane into alignment with the emergency vector. Sweat stung her eyes, her chest heaving with exertion. She had never imagined herself capable of such focus under pressure, yet she was doing it. She was controlling Flight 907. The intercom crackled again. Flight 907, you are aligned with the emergency approach. Reduce speed to 250 knots and maintain 32,000 feet. Emily's heart pounded. She adjusted the throttles carefully, bringing the airspeed down while keeping altitude. The plane groaned under the strain, the right engine threatening to fail entirely, but it held, just barely. In the cabin, passengers whispered, murmuring prayers, gripping loved ones, watching in stunned silence. Emily did not look back. She could feel the weight of their lives pressing into her shoulders, yet somehow it sharpened her focus rather than weakening her resolve. One misstep now would end everything. One correct move could guide them safely through the storm. As the plane leveled and the instruments stabilized, Emily allowed herself the briefest flicker of hope. She had executed the first maneuvers successfully. She had maintained control, balanced the failing engine, and aligned with ATC's emergency vector. The storm raged, the plane groaned, but Flight 907 had not yet succumbed to disaster. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she realized the enormity of what she had just done. She had taken control of a massive commercial aircraft under impossible circumstances and kept it airborne through chaos, panic, and an approaching storm. And yet, the most dangerous part was still ahead. Preparing for the descent, guiding 524 lives through turbulence, rain, and lightning to the safety of the runway below. She tightened her grip on the yoke, staring through the windshield at the dark, roiling clouds ahead. The storm showed no mercy. The right engine groaned with ominous insistence. Her chest ached from tension and adrenaline, and somewhere deep within, Emily felt a quiet, unyielding resolve settle into her bones. She would not fail. The storm was coming. The runway was still miles away, and Flight 907 was entirely, impossibly, in the hands of a quiet woman in 14C. Emily Carson's hands remained white-knuckled on the yoke as Flight 907 sliced through the storm. The plane shuddered violently with every blast of wind and lashing of rain, each strike of lightning illuminating the cabin in brief, horrifying clarity. She could feel the subtle groan of the failing right engine under her fingertips, a constant reminder that any miscalculation could send the plane plummeting into chaos. 524 lives hung by the thinnest of threads, and she was the only one keeping them from snapping. The intercom crackled, ATC's calm voice cutting through the cacophony. Flight 907, commence descent. Maintain speed at 250 knots. We have vectors for emergency approach to runway 27R. Confirm you copy. Emily swallowed hard, voice steady despite the pounding in her chest. Copy. Commencing descent now. She glanced at the instruments, altitude indicators, airspeed, vertical speed, everything screamed precision. Any wrong adjustment could send the plane into a nosedive. Her fingers moved almost automatically, nudging the throttles and yoke to maintain balance. The autopilot flickered, reluctant, yet compliant enough to assist her delicate maneuvers. The first 100 feet of descent were deceptively smooth. Then the storm roared with renewed fury, tossing the plane in a violent roll. Lightning split the sky, revealing terrified faces in the cabin. Children screamed, parents gripped them tighter, and flight attendants moved frantically, though they had little control over the terror that had consumed the passengers. Emily's stomach lurched as the plane tilted dangerously, but she adjusted the yoke, countered with throttle adjustments, and stabilized the craft. Her muscles ached, every sense on high alert. She had done this before, but never with a plane this massive, never with this many lives, and never in a storm this vicious. She realized the truth of the situation. This was no longer about following procedures or watching tutorial videos. It was instinct, determination, and absolute focus. She had become the plane in a way, every vibration, every movement, every subtle sound guiding her actions. Another violent jolt threw her forward against the panel. A muffled scream echoed from the cabin as a service cart slid down the aisle, spilling items across terrified passengers. Emily pressed her forehead against the yoke briefly, closing her eyes to steady herself. One hand adjusted the throttle, the other guided the yoke. The plane responded, quivering under the strain, but held. She exhaled sharply. Temporary relief. The intercom crackled again. Flight 907, maintain heading 270. Altitude decreasing at 500 feet per minute. Storm intensity increasing. Confirm control of aircraft. Emily's voice was steady. I have control. She tightened her grip, eyes flicking between instruments and the storm-dark horizon. The runway was still miles away, obscured by the rain and clouds. The descent had begun, but every moment felt like a knife edge between survival and disaster. Suddenly, a louder groan erupted from the right engine. Emily's stomach dropped. She glanced at the instruments, engine temperature rising, pressure dropping. The engine was failing faster than anticipated. Panic threatened to creep into her mind, but she shoved it aside. One hand adjusted the throttle to compensate, nudging the remaining engine to provide more thrust. The autopilot attempted to assist, but Emily overrode it, instincts guiding her movements with precision she didn't know she possessed. A violent flash of lightning illuminated the cockpit, revealing the two pilots still slumped in their seats. Emily swallowed hard, forcing herself to ignore the horror of their unresponsiveness. She couldn't think about what had happened to them. She had to focus on the plane, on the descent, on the lives in her care. The cabin trembled violently as another jolt rocked the aircraft. Screams echoed, prayers whispered, hands gripped tightly to seats and loved ones. Emily's vision narrowed to the instruments, the autopilot, and the yoke beneath her hands. Every adjustment had to be perfect. One mistake could mean catastrophe. She adjusted the descent rate slightly, ensuring the plane maintained its heading while the storm lashed against it. Outside, the clouds swirled in turbulent eddies, lightning illuminating the landscape below in brief flashes. Rain lashed at the fuselage, the sound deafening. Every second was a battle against the elements, the failing engine, and gravity itself. Emily realized that she needed to communicate with the cabin to instill some measure of calm. She grabbed the intercom, voice trembling but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a minor emergency, but we are under control. Please remain calm and fasten your seatbelts." Murmurs of fear and disbelief rippled through the cabin. Some passengers cried softly, others whispered prayers, but the announcement seemed to give a fragile sense of hope. Emily returned her hands to the controls, forcing herself to focus. There was no room for distraction. Another violent tilt caused the plane to shudder. The failing engine groaned, the remaining engine roaring in protest under increased load. Emily adjusted the yoke, nudged the throttle, and slowly leveled the plane. Instruments flickered but stabilized just enough for her to continue the descent. The runway was approaching, though still hidden behind the storm. Every movement mattered. Every breath counted. The intercom crackled again. "Flight 907, you are on final approach. Reduce speed to 220 knots and maintain heading. Prepare for potential single-engine landing." Emily's stomach twisted. A single-engine landing. She had never done this before, not in a simulator, not in training. And yet she had no choice. She adjusted the throttles carefully, relying entirely on instinct and observation. The plane groaned, rocked, then leveled again. A small, fragile victory. The cabin had fallen into tense silence, broken only by the roar of engines and the occasional cry. Emily felt the weight of every life on board pressing against her chest. She had become the plane in a way, every vibration, every subtle movement, every sound guiding her actions. She could not fail. She would not fail. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the horizon just enough to reveal the distant lights of the runway. Emily's breath caught. Hope and fear intertwined in a chaotic knot. The storm was still raging, the failing engine still sputtering, but Flight 907 was aligned. She had brought the plane through the worst of the turbulence, stabilized the descent, and prepared for the final, most dangerous step: landing. She tightened her grip, adjusted the throttle for balance, and whispered to herself, "Just a little further. You can do this." The storm raged around them, the plane groaning under the strain, the passengers silent in tense anticipation. Emily Carson, the quiet woman in 14C, had navigated through chaos, panic, and mechanical failure. Now, all that remained was the ultimate test: bringing Flight 907 safely to the ground. Her heart pounded. The runway was close. The storm showed no mercy, and the fate of 524 lives rested entirely in her hands. Emily Carson's knuckles were white as she gripped the yoke, every nerve in her body taut with tension. The storm had not relented. Rain hammered against the fuselage, lightning split the dark sky in violent streaks, and the thunder of wind battered the aircraft as though the storm itself sought to undo her. The plane shuddered under her control, the right engine now groaning in near failure, every vibration resonating through the cabin and her very bones. She could see the faint glimmer of the runway lights in the distance, barely visible through the sheets of rain and clouds. It was both a beacon and a torment, so close, yet still shrouded by the storm's fury. She had survived the descent, stabilized the plane, and aligned with ATC's vectors, but landing would be the ultimate test. The thought of 524 lives hanging on her every move forced her to steady herself in a way she had never imagined possible. "Flight 907, you are on final approach. Reduce speed to 200 knots. Prepare for single-engine landing," ATC instructed calmly, though Emily could almost hear the tension behind their voice. She nodded even though they couldn't see her. Adjusting the throttles carefully, she allowed the left engine to bear the brunt of the aircraft's weight, while keeping the failing right engine at minimal output. Every movement was painstakingly precise, a dance between control and chaos. The plane dipped slightly as a sudden gust of wind struck the left wing. A scream erupted from the cabin. Emily's stomach dropped, but her hands moved instinctively, nudging the yoke, adjusting the throttle, compensating for the turbulence. She could feel the strain on the airframe, the engines, and herself. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced, an unrelenting symphony of fear, focus, and raw adrenaline. Lightning illuminated the cockpit, revealing the two slumped pilots. Emily's stomach twisted. The stark reality of their condition reminded her that she could not falter. She pressed forward, guiding the plane through the storm with unwavering focus. Her eyes alternated between instruments, the faint runway lights and the horizon barely visible through the storm. Every second mattered. Every movement counted. The cabin trembled violently as another jolt rocked the aircraft. Passengers screamed, clutched loved ones, prayed silently or audibly. Emily's vision narrowed to the yoke, the throttles, the instruments. She adjusted, nudged, corrected, each micro-movement a battle against the forces conspiring to bring the plane down. She was no longer just a passenger. She was the captain, the sole human line between survival and catastrophe. She reached for the landing checklist in her mind, a patchwork of knowledge gleaned from flight videos, safety tutorials, and pure intuition. Gear down, flaps extended, airspeed adjusted, engine strain monitored. She spoke quietly to herself, a mantra against panic. Steady, steady, steady. The plane dipped again as another gust rocked the fuselage. The right engine sputtered, threatening to fail entirely. Emily's heart pounded. She compensated with the left throttle, nudged the yoke, and held her breath as the plane stabilized, albeit precariously. Her body ached with tension, but there was no room for relief yet. The runway was close, but still obscured by sheets of rain and turbulence. In the cabin, silence reigned, a tense, fragile calm broken only by the occasional cry or whimper. Passengers instinctively understood the gravity of the moment. Emily could feel their collective fear, their hopes intertwined with her actions. She forced herself to block it out, focusing entirely on the instruments and the delicate balance required to keep Flight 907 airborne and aligned for landing. Reduce speed to 180 knots. Align with runway centerline, ATC instructed. Emily's stomach twisted. The plane had to descend further, maintain heading, and adjust for a single-engine landing. She nudged the yoke gently, guided the throttles with precision, and adjusted the flaps incrementally. The aircraft responded, quivering under the strain but holding. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the cabin in stark white light. Emily's breath caught as she caught glimpses of terrified faces, mothers gripping children, men and women whispering prayers or muttering curses. She could feel the weight of their lives pressing into her shoulders, yet it steeled her determination. She would not let them die. Not now. Not ever. The plane pitched slightly as a gust struck from the right. Emily's stomach dropped, adrenaline spiking. She countered immediately, nudging the yoke, adjusting throttles, flaring gently to maintain level. The runway lights, faint but real, cut through the storm like a promise. She adjusted the approach angle carefully, calculating the descent rate, balancing speed with altitude, fighting against gravity, turbulence, and mechanical failure. The right engine groaned and sputtered again, a harsh, terrifying note. Emily felt her chest tighten. One more failure and the plane would tilt dangerously. She pressed forward on the yoke, nudged the left throttle, flared slightly, and held the plane steady. Sweat stung her eyes, muscles trembled from tension, yet her focus remained razor-sharp. This was it. This was the moment. She could feel the landing gear tremble as it extended, flaps fully deployed, airspeed precisely controlled. The runway, a thin ribbon of light ahead, became more visible through the rain. Emily's heart raced. One wrong move could send Flight 907 into disaster. She counted her breaths, each one deliberate, each one a tether to calm. A violent gust struck the plane from the left. The fuselage tilted, passengers gasped, flight attendants shouted, and Emily's hands moved faster than thought could process. The yoke responded, throttles adjusted, flaps corrected. The plane leveled, stabilized, and for a fleeting moment she allowed herself to exhale. The runway was closer. She was aligned. The storm still raged, but Flight 907 remained intact. "Hold steady," Emily whispered to herself, as if speaking to the plane. "Hold steady, hold steady." The final descent began. Emily guided the plane down, inching closer to the runway, every vibration, every sound, every subtle shift informing her next move. The storm lashed violently, the engines groaned under strain, but she remained resolute. Her hands were a conduit between survival and catastrophe. A flash of lightning revealed the full expanse of the runway below. Emily's heart surged with hope, but fear remained. She knew that the final landing would demand everything she had. She adjusted speed, descent rate, and angle simultaneously, balancing the failing engine with every ounce of control she could muster. Passengers whispered prayers, clutched loved ones, eyes wide. Some stared in awe at the woman in 14C who had become their lifeline. Emily didn't look back. She didn't have the luxury of distraction. Every second mattered, every movement critical. The wheels touched down on the wet tarmac with a violent shudder. Rain sprayed in sheets. The plane groaned under the sudden deceleration, and Emily guided Flight 907 with hands trembling but precise, countering drift, balancing speed, and keeping the aircraft centered. The runway stretched ahead, slippery and unforgiving, yet the plane obeyed her. ATC's voice crackled, filled with quiet awe. "Flight 907, you have landed. Emergency services are on standby." Emily's breath caught. She had done it. Somehow, impossibly, against storm, panic, and mechanical failure, she had landed Flight 907. She allowed herself a brief moment of relief, but the roar of the storm, the groan of the engines, and the knowledge that she still had to bring the plane safely to a full stop kept her focused. She gently applied brakes, guiding the plane down the runway, keeping it straight. The engines whined as the right engine struggled to maintain idle. Sweat ran down her face, her muscles quivering from exertion and adrenaline. Finally, the plane slowed, tires screeching faintly against wet tarmac, and came to a trembling but intact stop. Silence fell in the cabin. The storm raged outside, but inside there was a fragile, reverent calm. Emily leaned back, heart pounding, trembling from the intensity of what she had just accomplished. She looked at the two pilots, still unconscious, and then at the passengers, their faces pale but alive, their eyes wide with disbelief and awe. The intercom crackled once more. Flight 907, emergency landing successful. All passengers accounted for. You saved them. Emily allowed herself a shiver of relief. She had done the impossible. She had taken control, navigated the storm, compensated for mechanical failure, and brought 524 lives safely to the ground. And yet, a new wave of exhaustion hit her. She had survived, but the enormity of what had just occurred weighed on her heavily. The storm continued to howl outside, but inside Flight 907, a quiet triumph lingered. Emily Carson, the quiet woman in 14C, had become something extraordinary. The plane had obeyed her hands, the lives she carried had been spared, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to simply breathe. And though the storm was not over, though the engine still groaned, and though the pilots remained unconscious, one undeniable truth remained. Flight 907 had landed, against all odds, because one woman refused to surrender to fear. The rain still hammered down, but Flight 907 sat motionless on the tarmac, engines whining faintly as emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Sirens blared, flashing red and blue against the storm-darkened runway. Emily Carson's body trembled, not from fear now, but from the exhaustion of hours spent balancing terror, responsibility, and life itself. Her hands were raw from gripping the yoke, her muscles stiff and quivering, yet her mind remained painfully alert. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't paused to process the impossible feat she had just accomplished. Passengers sat frozen in their seats, wide-eyed and silent at first, disbelief mixing with relief. Mothers held children tightly, men wiped tears from their eyes, and some whispered prayers under trembling breaths. The cabin, once filled with chaos, panic, and screams, now held a fragile, reverent silence. Emily's eyes scanned the faces, her heart swelling and aching at the sheer human weight of what had just transpired. Every life on this plane had survived because she had refused to falter. The flight attendants moved first, standing in the aisles, hands shaking as they guided passengers to remain seated until help could reach them. Some of them whispered congratulations, others simply stared at Emily with awe. She nodded faintly, unable to speak immediately. The reality of what she had done, the magnitude of her responsibility, was only beginning to seep into her consciousness. One of the emergency responders reached the cockpit, guiding Emily to release the yoke. Her fingers reluctantly unclasped from the controls, leaving her feeling suddenly hollow. She had been the heartbeat of Flight 907 for hours, and now the plane seemed almost unreal, inert and silent. The responder's hand on her shoulder grounded her, a reminder that she had survived, and that the passengers had survived too. "Miss Carson," the responder said, voice steady, "you saved them, every last one." Emily nodded again, blinking rapidly. Words eluded her. How could she summarize the terror, the adrenaline, the desperate decisions, the near-death moments? How could anyone comprehend what it had taken to guide a massive commercial plane through a storm and bring 524 lives safely to the ground? She could only nod, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Outside, emergency crews were moving swiftly. Fire trucks lined the tarmac, paramedics rushed to check on passengers, and airport security ensured the chaos remained contained. The storm continued to rage, but on the runway, human determination now outweighed the fury of nature. Emily followed the responders as they led her from the cockpit, every step feeling surreal. She passed passengers, some smiling weakly, some clinging to loved ones, all alive because of her. Journalists and airport officials were already gathering, sirens mixing with camera flashes. Emily's story had begun before she even stepped off the plane. News crews filmed the emergency landing from every angle, passengers whispered stories of the quiet woman who had taken control, and social media buzzed with disbelief. Woman in 14C saves 524 lives. Flight attendant turned captain guides plane to safety. Miracle landing by unknown hero. Emily didn't feel like a hero. She felt like exhaustion, disbelief, and relief all wrapped into one fragile shell. But she allowed herself a quiet acknowledgement of what she had accomplished. She had acted when no one else could, guided the plane through disaster, and preserved life. That was heroism enough. Airport officials began to interview passengers. Mothers spoke of Emily's calm demeanor and the way she had guided the plane. Passengers whispered about her quiet courage, and flight attendants praised her quick thinking. One elderly man, voice trembling, said simply, "She kept us alive. That's all there is to it." Emily blinked rapidly, trying to absorb the words, trying to understand the reality that she had actually done something extraordinary. The two pilots, still unconscious, were being attended to by paramedics. Emily's stomach clenched at the sight. She had no idea what had caused their collapse, whether it was illness, fatigue, or something more sinister. The thought that they might not recover fully added a layer of guilt she could not shake. Yet she had done her part, and the passengers were safe. That, she reminded herself, was everything. Once the passengers were escorted safely from the plane, Emily was led to a quieter area of the airport, away from the cameras and chaos. Her legs shook, exhaustion weighing on her so heavily it was almost physical pain. She sank into a chair, head in her hands, trying to process the whirlwind that had consumed hours of her life. She had never flown a real plane before, had never imagined herself in such a position, and yet she had succeeded. Somehow, impossibly, she had succeeded. Emergency personnel checked on her, ensuring she was unharmed, though her trembling hands and rapid pulse betrayed the toll of adrenaline and fear. They offered water and blankets, simple comforts, but nothing could undo the intensity of the hours she had just survived. It was then that a small group of passengers approached, hesitant at first but growing in courage. Mothers, children, elderly men, and business people alike surrounded her. One child held out a hand, shyly saying, "Thank you for saving us." Emily's eyes filled with tears. Words were impossible. She could only nod, allow herself to be human, allow herself to feel the raw, emotional weight of what had just transpired. Local news crews gathered, capturing the story for the nation. Social media erupted, recounting her bravery, the miraculous landing, and the storm that had threatened 524 lives. Hashtags trended. Flight 907 hero, Emily Carson saves lives. Woman in 14C, she had become a symbol, a quiet, extraordinary hero, though she had never sought recognition. Later, at a press conference organized by the airline and airport officials, Emily was introduced as the woman who had taken control. The room erupted into applause, some teary-eyed, others standing in awe. She stepped forward, voice trembling but firm. I did what anyone would do in that situation. I saw people in danger and I acted. I wasn't trained for this. I just tried to keep everyone alive." Her humility only amplified the admiration in the room. Airline officials spoke of her extraordinary courage, the pilot's condition, and the miraculous nature of her emergency landing. Reporters pressed questions, but Emily remained calm, deflecting attention from herself to the passengers and the teams that had supported her after landing. Later that evening, as she finally sat alone in a quiet corner of her home, Emily reflected on the events of the day. The storm, the failing engine, the panic, the weight of responsibility. She relived every second, every decision, every trembling motion of the yoke. Her hands were still sore, her muscles ached, but the knowledge that 524 lives had been preserved filled her with a profound, quiet pride. News outlets across the nation ran stories about her heroism. Airlines, emergency responders, and even the FAA praised her quick thinking and courage. Social media users celebrated the woman who had risen from anonymity to become a symbol of resilience and bravery. Yet Emily remained quiet, humble, focusing on the simple truth. She had done what needed to be done. She had acted when no one else could. She had saved lives. In the days that followed, she received messages from passengers, some simple thank you notes, others long letters recounting how her actions had given them hope, had kept them alive, had preserved family and love in the face of unimaginable disaster. Emily read each one quietly, tears streaming silently, realizing that she had changed lives irrevocably. The pilots eventually recovered, bewildered and grateful. When they learned what Emily had done, they insisted she receive formal recognition, awards, and even a ceremonial captain's certificate. But she brushed off accolades quietly, only agreeing because she knew it would reassure the passengers and honor the lives saved. Months later, she was invited to speak at aviation conferences, safety seminars, and emergency response events. Yet despite the public attention, Emily remained the same quiet woman from 14C, only now, everyone knew the extraordinary courage that lay within. She had faced fear, chaos, and near impossible odds, and emerged as a symbol of bravery and human resilience. And though she never sought fame, Emily Carson's name became synonymous with courage, decisiveness, and quiet heroism. She had taken control when all others had faltered, guided a plane through a storm that could have claimed hundreds of lives, and shown the world that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when faced with impossible circumstances. On a quiet evening, sitting by the window and watching a sunset break through lingering storm clouds, Emily allowed herself a rare, small smile. She had saved them, every single one. And though the storm had raged with fury, she had emerged not just alive but triumphant, not in the way fame or awards could measure, but in the lives she had preserved. In the end, the quiet woman in 14C had become a legend, not for her name, not for recognition, but for a courage that had shone brighter than any storm. And somewhere, deep in the hearts of 524 people, Emily Carson would never be forgotten.